All right, in this quick behavior course recap, we just want to remind you all of the different things that you've been through as you've come through this course with us, and remind you kind of where you can go back to for additional information. So if we remember all the way back to the very beginning, we've talked about this DBI model for intensive academic need. On the behavior side, we've built a somewhat parallel process where we start by implementing these 5 critical features of classroom management. We make sure we get that in place with fidelity. We double check those pieces. And then we progress monitor student response to that. If it's working, keep going. If it's not working, intensify. Think about how you can adjust those. We've talked about lots of strategies as we go through that. We're then going to continue to monitor. If it's not working, we can intensify and adjust in other ways. If it's still not working, we're going to do really intensive behavior support for students. And it's really the process we've taken you through in this course. You'll remember back to Module 1, we started out with some basic behavior theory. We gave you a lot of vocabulary to work your way through. We defined behaviors, antecedents, consequences, and talked about this as being the basis of everything else that we're going to do. This 3-term contingency helps us understand the function of behavior and helps us put together behavior support plans. We also defined setting events and moved our way through those pieces as the basic building blocks of behavior. We then defined different types of consequence strategies. We talked about adding and taking things from the environment. We talked about the future effect on behavior and putting those things all together. We have 4 different types of consequences: positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. The vocabulary should all be coming back to you now. When we think about those pieces, we also talked about 3 different types of antecedents. And these signal to the learner what type of reinforcement is available. So the discriminative stimulus lets the learner know that reinforcement is available. The S delta says no particular response is available. And SD minus signals that if you engage in this behavior right now, punishment is likely to follow. And so those different antecedents help us teach kids when to use different behaviors. And the consequences help us understand why they're using those behaviors and how to adjust the environment. The whole idea here is that we are going to put behavior in this context of the antecedents and the consequences and really think about how we manipulate the environment to support kid behavior rather than try to change the kid. We're going to look at changing the environment or changing the adult responses. We then talked about how to figure out the function of behavior. We look at this pattern of what happens before, what's the behavior look like, and what happens after. And by looking at that pattern across time, we can determine the function of the behavior. We talked about the fact that there are 2 major functions of behavior: to get or obtain something or to escape or avoid something. And that's based on the history of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is getting or obtaining something. Negative reinforcement, escaping or avoiding something. That something can be lots of different things. In Module 2, we went a little bit deeper with this. We spent a little bit more time on setting events, thinking about these as things that alter the value of the consequence. They're temporary things that alter the value of a consequence on a particular situation, things like being tired, things like being sick. We then talked about all the different behavioral strategies for teaching, shaping, using a task analysis and chaining, using stimulus control, using prompting. All of these different strategies are the things we use to help teach new behaviors or help shape behaviors from one dimension, along one dimension or another as we kind of move through this process with kids. And so those are all the different strategies that we then applied later on in the course. We talked about the phases of learning. We want to make sure we're moving kids from acquisition, where they just understand how to do something accurately, through fluency, where they can do it at a regular rate, maintenance, they can do it across time, generalization, they can adapt their response or their behavior to new situations and new applications of that particular behavior. In Module 3, we started to actually dive into the specific strategies that we're going to use in the classroom. In this module, we focused on those antecedent and instructional practices, and we first introduced these 5 critical features of classroom management: maximizing structure, establishing and teaching expectations, actively engaging kids in the instruction, and then having a continuum of strategies to acknowledge appropriate behavior and discourage inappropriate behavior. And this becomes the basis of everything else that we do. You'll remember that these are in order on purpose. We're going to spend most of our time and energy on the first 3, and we're going to fall back on the last 2 only when those first 3 aren't sufficient, and that each of these needs to be adapted to your particular classroom or instructional group and the particular needs of the students that you're supporting. And so one of the things we've challenged you to do throughout this whole course is take the critical features of the strategy that we're describing and adjust it, make it work for your environment. What is it that your particular students need? We used this behavior resource guide, the Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior Guide, to kind of work our way through this entire course. We talked about making sure that these foundational things are in place first. We need to effectively design the physical environment of the classroom, develop routines, and define and teach our classroom expectations. And that those are those foundational practices. Once those are in place, we're going to think about making sure that our positive, proactive practices are in place. High rates of opportunities to respond, prompts, and active supervision. In Module 4, we added one more thing to that piece. We talked about acknowledging appropriate behavior using specific praise and other strategies. We defined what specific praise was. We gave you lots of practice opportunity with that. That's your non-negotiable. That's the piece that should be present for every student in every classroom. We also talked about other strategies that you can layer on top of that. Behavior contracts, group contingencies, and token economies. Those are things you might layer on. They might be in place all the time in your classroom. You might go to these strategies as an extra dose when you know that you're going to have a particularly difficult group or a particular difficult time of the year, all of those things. These are additional strategies that you can layer on. In Module 5, we talked about consequence strategies to decrease behavior. These are the punishment strategies that reduce the likelihood that behavior will continue to happen again in the future. We went through this last section where we said, all right, do the data indicate that students are still engaging in problem behavior? We use this flow chart to help us make decisions. If they are, we needed to ask some additional questions. If they're not, we're going to celebrate and continue to monitor to make sure that's working. Most likely, you're going to put all of these things in place and you're still going to have some problem behaviors in your classroom. So the next question is, are they major or minor? And we talked a lot about defining those pieces, making sure you're really clear on the difference between a minor violation and a major violation, and making sure that everybody on your team is fluent with that. If it's minor, we talked about using brief specific error corrections and a couple of other strategies that we could layer on top of that. If it's major, we had some additional questions we had to ask about how many students are involved. If it's most of the group, this is signaling that our Tier 1 or Tier 2 interventions are not strong enough yet, and we need to go back and intensify those strategies. If we're really down to just a couple of kids that are engaged in these major problem behaviors, that's when we're going to request additional support. So this flow chart should help you think about when you go into different strategies. In this module, we spent some time thinking about brief specific error corrections and those additional strategies like planned ignoring, differential reinforcement, response cost, and timeout from reinforcement that you can layer on to discourage the ongoing use of problem behaviors in your classroom. In Module 6, we moved on to thinking about how do we measure behavior. What is it that we're going to measure in order to make sure that we have data to guide this whole process in the first place? We started out by thinking about which behaviors are appropriate to choose and really holding ourselves accountable to the idea that our job is to make life better for kids, not necessarily to reduce pet peeves of teachers. We want to really make sure we're choosing appropriate target behaviors. We wrote clear operational definitions for those behaviors. We used the dimensions of behavior to refine those operational definitions even further. We then used that to help us select a measurement system that made sense in the environment and with the precision that we needed. And then we talked about how to use graphing to help us guide decision making, put that data in a graph to help guide decision making. In Module 7, we went a little bit further with database decision making, and we walked through this 4-question process. The first one being, are those critical features of classroom management in place with fidelity? And we talked about different strategies and different measurement techniques that you could use to measure that, different checklists. Then we said, if that's true, are kids experiencing the desired outcomes? Do we see what we wanted to see from kids? And we talked about measurement strategies that we could use to measure that. If the answer is no, we talked about how to really define a precision problem statement, really figuring out what's the nature of the problem, who's involved, what is it, why is it happening, and then using that information to develop an action plan or a solution plan, where we think about how to prevent the problem behavior from happening, what do we teach instead, and how do we adjust our consequence strategies. And then that's a cycle that we continue to go through. And For each box, we have to consider social validity and equity, and there's additional resources available in that data guide that support those pieces that we did not cover in this course. We talked about putting together the solution plan that focuses first on prevention and teaching and recognition, and then moves to corrective consequences later, and always include your data collection pieces. As we move forward in this course, we talked about how to intensify behavior support, and in a giant module 8, we covered all of Tier 2 and Tier 3, with the caveat that it's really a preview to help you know what to look for in good plans and to know where you might want to go learn more, not a training in exactly how to do those things. So we started with Tier 2, where we talked about if we have a group of kids who are displaying frequent challenging behaviors, that we're going to look at Tier 2 strategies. And the big idea of Tier 2 is really just that it's intensifying Tier 1. It's an extra dose, giving kids a little bit of additional support. We talked about some specific strategies that you can use to do that. So you can go back to this module to look at those pieces. And then in part 2 of this last module, we talked about what good individualized support plans look like for kids, and how to think about using a functional behavior assessment and a behavior support plan and implementing that in a coordinated wraparound process for kids. And that brings us to the end of this course.